And you are just in time for your first live episode of Business Redefined of 2022. Welcome to this conversation where we are delving into the critical subject of power tariffs. And Kenyans have been having these conversations ever since the president announced on the 20th of October last year that the government was intent upon reducing power tariffs by as much as 33% in a period of just 4 months. Now, on Friday 7th, January 2022, the Ministry of Energy gazetted new electricity tariffs in what makes for the first phase of compliance with the promised 30% reduction of tariffs following the Power Purchase Agreements Task Force report. This was not the first task force report on power purchase agreements in Kenya. In the recent past, a similar report was handed over to the government on May 31st, 2018. Now, in the latest task force report, the government proclaimed that it would reduce consumer tariffs from an average of 24 shillings per kilowatt hour to 16 shillings per kilowatt hour in just 4 months. Now, tonight we want to unpack this subject, and I'll be introducing my guests a little shortly, but let's look at two graphics to give us a sense of where we are right now. Based on the latest communication from the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, the new electricity tariffs for the domestic, that is the DCI lifeline, has been reduced from 10 shillings per unit consumed to just 7 shillings and 70 cents. That's about 23% down. And now let's look at the other category for domestic consumers, where we are looking at a change from 15 shillings and 80 cents per unit consumed, down now to 12 shillings and 60 cents per unit consumed. That's a dip of about 20.25%. We shall be unpacking a lot more of this, and I am joined by Kilner Dorothea, who is the CEO and founder of Kenergy Renewables, and she's joining us in studio tonight, as well as Thuo, who is also joining us, Thuo Njoroge Daniel from the Africa Utility Forum, where he is the director in charge of strategy and policy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on set. Let me start very quickly with a quote here from the Power Purchase Task Force report, and this question goes to Kilner. This is what the report said. The IPP supply 25% of Kenya Power's total offtake, but account for 47% of its purchase costs. KenGen, on the other hand, supplies 72% of KPLC's offtake, but accounts for 48% of its cost. And the question here is, was there a fundamental misalignment when we look at the cost structure of IPPs?
Julian, thank you so much for having me on air today. And that is an excellent question, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about IPPs and what is their role. So I'd like to take you back to the 90s, when we had KenGen as the only generator here in Kenya. At some point, the donors, such as World Bank, etc., started to say to the Kenyan government, look, you can't keep investing only in electricity generation. We need you to expand to looking at social and health investments as well. However, this meant that there would have been a gap in electricity generation, and we would have had an electricity shortfall. So what was done was there was an encouragement for private sector to come in and start investing. And these producers are called independent power producers. Those are the IPPs. Kenya was highly progressive in Africa to start unbundling the system and bringing private sector investment in. And that has served us extremely well to ensure that we don't have electricity shortages. We are using a good optimum of government debt through KenGen and the private sector through IPPs to ensure we have a stable electricity supply. Now, you ask about the potential misalignment. So I'd like to address that, because I think there's been misunderstanding on how we compare KenGen tariffs and how we compare independent power producer tariffs. So, first and foremost, different technologies, solar, wind, geothermal, thermal power plants, heavy fuel oil, etc., all have different costs. So when you go to the supermarket or the grocers and you buy apples and oranges, they all have different costs. Similarly, different technologies have different costs associated with them. So we cannot compare an average KenGen cost with, a particular power plants from the private sector. We have to compare apples with apples. Number two, why is KenGen being able to generate at cheaper costs? Another point is the cost of financing. You as an individual could go to the bank. What is the interest that you will get on your loan? Most likely 14%. Kenya goes to borrow money in the international markets through bilateral agreements. They are bound to get much, much cheaper cost of capital. I think KenGen's average cost of capital is probably 2%, unlike IPPs, which are seeing 7.5%. So that already starts to account for the differences in the cost of generation. Number three, we have to be aware that KenGen has at least 60% of its power generation capacity that was installed over 20 years ago, right? So it's no longer repaying loans or interest on this. So an easier analogy would be, let's say you and I are both developing a building project. You bought your land 30 years ago and you have no mortgage, you've paid the bank off. I'm going to start building and buying the land today. If our building costs are the same, but I'm purchasing the land today and you purchased it 30 years ago, who will have the cheaper project?
Yeah.
You will, right? So this is the same analogy. KenGen has paid off a lot of the costs. It's looking at amortized power projects. So this is why some of their projects have much cheaper generation capacities.
Let me just hold you there, Kila. I'll be coming back to that point on KenGen and just get the introductory thoughts from Thuo, who is also with us. Thuo, we had a very interesting conversation just before we came on set, and my question to you was, when I saw the government commit to reduce tariffs by as much as 33% in 4 months, I was shocked because I'd imagine there has to be fundamental changes in the infrastructure that underlies transmission for this to be realized. But you are of the counter view that it was actually feasible.
Thank you, Julian, and thanks for having me here. Let me begin to say this. To better understand this arrangement, if you could remember, the head of state did put what he called the initial actions, so which informed why he had to decompose, or rather government had to decompose the 30% reduction into 2 tranches. So the first tranches that focused on what can be done in a very short-term period, and then the other 15% tranche that will subsequently be arrived and achieved. Now, if you look at 15%, the first tranches that you're talking about, 2 things were very inherent, or rather became the focus of the entire steering committee, as well as the agency, the Ministry of Energy, and now Kenya Power, where a lot of work is being done. So there were systemic issues around Kenya Power that needed to be addressed, or rather needed serious intervention. So we had first the issue of commercial losses, which has been a very big thorny issue. If you could remember, in their financial statement for Kenya Power, debt that would inherently be termed as bad debt was significant in their financial statements. So this is what happened. In my understanding, a lot of concerted effort between the steering committee, between the ministry, madrins in the ministry, and now managers at Kenya Power, were to go for all those what you may call bad debts, to be able to arrest those debts and convert those debts into revenues. It would interest you, Julian, actually, that there were those debts that had accrued to a period of about even 9 years, 15 years. So you can imagine there are clients there out there who are holding Kenya Power money in terms of debt that accrued to for that given period of time, 2 years. So if you look at how now that has happened in the recent past, those debts have been significantly converted into revenues, because they have gone, they have engaged with customers, they have employed other mechanisms that are supposed to translate those debts into revenues coming in. That is number one. So that addresses the issue of commercial losses. The second aspect, which I'm sure you're very interested to know, is an issue of tariff. If you look at tariff, especially the new arrangement of tariff that has been architectured and gazetted, which is what we are talking about, you realize, so 15% has been reduced. And you may want to understand how then did they arrive at the 15% reduction? And where then does that put, utility companies such as Kenya Power? Yeah. Because me and you know, previous years, 2 years ago, these utility companies were limping financially. They were under financial constraint. So this is what happened. If you look at the entire components of billing, which has at most, I think, if I'm not wrong, 4 components. So you have we have forex. That is usually, if you look at your billing component, we have the forex. We have what you call the inflation. That component is very clear in your billing. We have what you call the fuel charge cost. That component is very clear in your bill. And then you have what you are calling the cost of fuel. Because me and you know, and a good number of energy generators in these countries have thermo generated, which means fuel is included. Yeah. Now, in the previous arrangements, that is before the gazettement of the tariffs came into the picture, the entire 4 components were subjected to VAT. So you could have, or rather we had VAT on inflation, we had VAT on what I call the forex, the foreign exchange. We had VAT on cost of fuel. We had VAT on consumed units by a given client, or what you may call capacity charge. Now, in this new arrangement then, which now brings answers, or rather speaks to that question on how then did government look at balancing this, we only have 2 components that are subjected to VAT. That is fuel cost charge and capacity charge, or what you may refer to as the consumed unit by a given client. And if you look at it, even from a very broad perspective, why did you have to charge VAT, for instance, on inflation? I don't see there is no rationale. Why did you have to charge VAT, for instance, on forex? It makes more sense to charge a client, electricity clients, VAT on what he has consumed, including those components that were engaged in the production process of that energy. Yeah. So that alone brings about the issue of reduction, and how now Kenya Power cannot slide back into what you're calling financial constraint. But let me also explain a very critical area.
Briefly.
Julian. So we have this thing called, we've been having this conversation all along, and it was perfectly put in law, the Energy Act 2019, of what we are calling the independent system operator. For the longest time, since 2019, these mandates were squarely now transferred to what we are calling Kentraco as one of the entity. And the rationale therein was, it will only make sense to have an independent system operator who mainly does the function of dispatching power, who does not buy power. So he is not interested so much on who buys power, because he doesn't buy. Me and you know that Kenya Power signs the PPA. So Kenya Power has, or there could be, potential interest, conflict of interest, when they are the ones dispatching power. In actual fact, in the previous arrangement, the Kenya Power was dispatching power based on convenience rather than objectivity. In this new arrangement, and it is not yet fully actualized because transition is still taking place at the National Control Center, the contractor now who has been given that mandate, which is Kentraco, is required to only dispatch power according to guidelines, laid down rules and guidelines. And among is critical to those guidelines is the least cost power to Kenyans. So unlike before, when Kenya Power now could be able to dispatch power to Kenyans according to maybe the cost of power they are buying, or whatever kind of interest they have on a certain power plant, in this new arrangement then, you only dispatch power basing on the least cost power to the consumer. And what does that mean then in the financial statement of Kenya Power? What that inherently means is that it decreases significantly what we call the energy purchase cost component
Mr. Thor, let me hold you there. I'm told by my director we need to quickly take a break and come back, where I shall be getting back on rebuttals on some of the issues which have been raised here by both Kilner and Thor here. So stay tuned. We shall be back shortly.
Watu wa Kenya, Christmas has come early on StarTimes. Pay 2 months today and get 2 months of higher bouquet to enjoy the best programs for the ladies this Christmas. StarTimes, your best choice for family entertainment this festive season.
I wish I could have soft and glowing skin.
New Geisha Black Soap with activated charcoal to give you soft and glowing skin. New Geisha Black Soap and New Geisha Moringa.
Wow, thank you for your time. How juicy.
Juicy. Niko fiti maze niko fiti majama na mabenti wako fiti juicy fruit.
Welcome back to this conversation on Business Redefined, where we are discussing the revised power tariffs with my panelists, Kilner Dorothea and Thor Daniel. Welcome back on set. Very quickly, Kilner, there's something you raised around the issue of the tariff comparison between KenGen and the IPPs. And let me just pick up that because what we are experiencing in Kenya right now is not an issue unique to Kenya. We have seen ESCOM in South Africa having a similar conversation with IPPs. We've seen the same conversation happening in Ghana. And the question underlying here is, do we have a problem around the transparency and the extent to which these tariffs reflect the market determination of at least trying to realize the most cost-effective prices to consumers?
Thanks for that question, Julian. I don't think we have a problem in determining the most cost-effective tariffs because most of the power plants that are online have come on board through the feed-in tariff in terms of wind and solar so far, and those were tariffs that were set by government. So, you know, power producers came in along the invitation from government, and I think at the time these power projects were built, those tariffs were in order. Yes, costs are coming down. Having said that, since 2020, the cost of wind and solar has actually gone up due to disruptions in the supply chain and the increase in primary raw materials. You're actually seeing a 20% increase in the cost of equipment, which is meaning that solar and wind are now going up in cost at the moment. So I think the tariffs we had were reflective of the time that we were looking to actually start the electricity generation of these projects. Yeah.
Okay, and coming to Thor, you mentioned the Energy Act of 2019 and the fact that it created bandwidth for the government to be able to scale down this cost of electricity. But the Energy Act, to be fair, of 2019 came into force way earlier before this task force. And some of these things you're mentioning were already in play. If you look at something like the adjustments as far as VAT is concerned, they're already in place. So how was it to happen beyond Jamhuri Day last year, Mashujaa Day actually, when this proclamation was made, to be able now to feed in and now have an impact on the consumer's cost?
What happened, Julian, is that the conversation between the regulator, or rather what was there in the entire electricity ecosystem, was how then do we, that conversation has been going back, has been ongoing. When do we drop? How do we drop? What are the elements to look into? It is not until now, in this new arrangement where we're having the gazettement, that VAT in the two components that I have explained in the form that I have, that have now been devoted, or rather vacated. In the new one, And then, of course, now in favor of those two components that I've said, now require or rather attract VAT. On the issue of ISO, the Independent System Operator, yeah. This was one of the critical concerns, and I appeared before the Presidential Task Force, both in written memoranda and in person. Theirs was, how is it then that it has taken them close to 3 hours, let me say, 2019 to 2020, 3 hours, so to speak. I mean, 3 years, so to speak. How then has it taken that long without transition to the new registered and designated ISO? And it is, and that speaks volumes, Amboko, you could tell. These are the systemic issues that the head of state, we need to understand how he came up to this and why it informed the very immediate action or rather intervention in this very short term, what we call the short-term measures. This is what we're going to address in the short term, whereas the rest are going to be in the midterm. There has been a lot of undoings and ongoings at the utility. Okay. Yes.
Let me come to Kilner, and he's spoken about systemic issues, and the conversation around what we can do with transmission losses is a matter that is very critical around this conversation of reducing these tariffs. How much bandwidth do you think we have to leverage that as a factor in reducing this cost?
Okay, so let's look at the aggregate costs of losses of Kenya Power. They were at 26%, at least over a year ago. Now, those losses are made up of technical losses and commercial losses. Looking at the technical losses, that is where we can get savings from the infrastructure such as transmission lines and the distribution system. Now, for a country like Kenya, what we've been advised is the benchmark that was set was, can we take this down to 15%? That's an 11% saving directly, which is enormous because this is a system-wide saving. I think we must remember that the cost of power is not only the generation cost, it's the generation cost plus the transmission cost, plus the distribution cost, which includes the costs of running Kenya Power. And I think what's very interesting is you can do that by building out the infrastructure on lines. So one example is the Mariakani substation. So the Nairobi-Mombasa transmission line was built at 400 kV. Now, transmission lines are like leaky pipes. The higher the voltage, the less leaky the pipe. This is why we need a high voltage transmission network to reduce the leakage. That line was built at 400 kV, but in Mariakani, the substation was only built up to 220 kV. The minute that substation is upgraded, you will see the power costs come down for everyone because we will be able to send the cheaper geothermal power down to the coast and reduce the cost of the expensive thermal generation. Just another very simple point to make on transmission losses, what we must do is, because these pipes can be slightly leaky, is let's avoid transportation full stop. We need to start locating generation sources much closer to the demand centers. So, for example, the power plant that Kenergy Renewables is developing is in Rumuruti in Laikipia County. Rumuruti is going to be 280 kilometers away from the closest point of generation on the transmission grid. Looking at leaky pipes, 280 kilometers signifies a lot of leakage. What we've understood is that by having a 40 megawatt solar PV project in Rumuruti, what that will enable Kenya Power to do is reduce its transmission losses by 10.5 million units of electricity per year. What does this mean in financial terms? If KPLC could sell that electricity at 16 shillings, that's approximately 168 million shillings per annum that it could increase its revenues by. So, you know, there are a lot of benefits to projects that are located slightly further away but much closer to demand centers. So that's another element. And I think the task force report outlines these elements and they are looking at improving that. And then on the commercial losses, I think we need to look at digitization using smart meters, and I think this will increase accountability and transparency in the system. So that's 26% that we can play with. And that's an enormous amount of leeway.
So your thoughts on the transmission and distribution losses?
I couldn't agree more than what Kilin has said. What we call the second infrastructure, which is what transmission line speaks to, is another way through which you can be able to reduce, especially on the technical. Because if you remember, the losses, the transmission losses are decomposed into two, the commercial losses and the technical losses that now Kilin is explaining. But again, we have to also be very fair in the conversation and agree that a lot of concerted effort has been done in this area. Remember, the Western region, for instance, for the longest period of time, they have not been benefiting from the geothermal, which is like the least cost in this country, power. So recently, and you have indeed announced that in this media house, the resource, all carrier resource transmission line is complete, which inherently means the people from the Western region now can be able to use the least cost power. And again, that speaks to the financial component that I told you, because now, going forward, the dispatcher, the person who has that function to dispatch, now will be looking at them because now that area can be able, to benefit from that energy source. Equally with the south, a lot of the people in the region, I don't know if as yet we still have a fully fledged Mariakani substation. Maybe that one could speak the regulator or players in the sector, but it is the same rationale that should we now have this fully fledged, these people now we could be able to evacuate power and benefit from the least cost power. And that still speaks to what I just told you about, that the dispatcher now will have that privilege, the independent system operator, to give these regions power that is of least cost, which inherently reduces what we are calling the energy purchase cost.
Okay. Let me come to you, Kilner. And one of the concerns that I've received ever since the new tariffs were gazetted is that if you look at the structure of our electricity costs, a good chunk of it is about fuel charge and FX charge, Forex. And the concern is, do we have a risk of having the two factors wipe out the gains that could potentially be realized through the gazetted reduction? Because if you look at the shilling, it is sliding against the major currencies. If you look at the cost of petroleum products globally, they're on the uptick.
Thank you. So I think that's a very interesting question because it opens up a completely different avenue. So firstly, dealing with the fuel cost element. So interestingly enough, the task force report talked about our reserve margins being very low. So the available capacity Kenya has at the moment to generate at any time is roughly 2,400 megawatts. The actual peak capacity recorded most recently, I think, was just over 2,000 megawatts. So we have this reserve margin of 400 megawatts. You need a reserve margin to deal with the types of outages we're seeing, to deal with power plant outages as large as your largest generator on the system. Now, if in the next couple of months, what we're seeing at the moment is that the reserve margins are low, and we've been seeing an increase in demand. The task force report also mentioned that some of these power plants that are due to come online, and also the Ethiopia-Kenya line, could be delayed, bringing the hydropower down to Kenya. Also, there was a 200 megawatt LNG Kenyan power plant in the least cost power development plan. We don't yet have the port infrastructure to receive LNG. So where will that 200 megawatts come from? And I think whilst we're dealing with all these critical points on shaking up the power sector, making it as efficient as possible, let us not lose sight of the aspect that no power is the most expensive power of all. And at that point, that is when you will see the fuel costs go up, because we will have to start using the thermal power plants, not just to meet peaking power time, but also to meet baseload generation, and that will eat away at those reductions we're seeing right now. On the other aspect of Forex, so you know, yes, the forex is an element. So just to explain, you know, why is this an element of the bills? KenGen, but also independent power producers are all buying this equipment in dollars. And then they're going out there to borrow the money in dollars. And I think, you know, there are lots of people looking at, can we bring PPAs into Kenya shilling denominated PPAs? And I think that is great work that needs to keep going. For the moment where we stand is, if you go to the bank and you ask for a loan at the moment, the interest you will get is probably around 14%. Now, you know, IPPs have been working on this for over 20 years to bring down the cost of lending. And at the moment, IPPs are looking at dollar-denominated loans of about 7 to 7.5%. So you can see the balance is how much will the shilling devalue versus a cheaper loan in dollars or a more expensive tariff in shillings. So that is the balance that people are working on to figure out how can we get a shilling-denominated PPA. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for the sake of our viewers, I should clarify that when you talk about the reserve margin, she talks about the difference between your installed capacity and your peak demand, showing you what sort of legroom you have in the event that you have a surge in demand. You shouldn't be in a deficit situation where you have a shortage of electricity. Let me come to Thor. Your very quick thoughts on this issue of forex and fuel charge. Can they easily wipe out the gains that could be realized through this reduction?
My understanding is that issues to do with gazetting of tariffs are domiciled with the regulator. And what I see, and this is my thought now, what I see in the very near future, or rather in the immediate future, because of course you see there is also a lot of arrangements that are taking place in terms of negotiation. IPRA may want to sustain the current fuel costs, maybe for this month or maybe next month, as we wait the conclusion of what is taking place, the negotiation that is already taking place between the government and now the IPPs. Because like, again, I did say, for you to be able to appreciate and better understand the entire reductions of tariff, then we have to look at measures that are being taken in the first tranche, as well as measures that are already in progress in the second tranche for sustainability. So maybe in this, and this is me now, between now, February and March, I think April, that's what the head of state did say, IPRA may play about by retaining those fuel cost charge, even when maybe there might be slight volatility from the foreign denominations.
Well, let's hope that fuel charges retain, considering on the 14th you're waiting for the latest review from EPRA. Let me come to Kilna. And one of the questions I've received recurrently ever since Friday is that what does this reduction in tariffs mean for the sole distributor that we have, and that's Kenya Power, because 73% of their revenue comes from electricity sales. We understand what a tariff reduction means for it. Kenya Power just last year had been pitching for a rise upwards in tariffs. Are you bothered by what this means?
I think as someone who sees Kenya Power as the off-taker who will purchase all the electricity we produce, what's critical is to ensure Kenya Power is a sustainable, viable entity, because that is what allows us to get the lowest cost of financing into independent power producer projects. I think Thu mentioned that there has been a lot of securing bad debts on the Kenya Power side. Now, if this is where that 15% is coming from, that is fantastic. And I must say, I have to congratulate, the Ministry of Energy, the task force, and the President for really shaking things up. And if we can provide these savings to consumers in the immediate future, that is excellent. And then I think we have to look for longer-term solutions on how to continue such savings. I would request that EPRA clarify where this 15% is coming from, and hence we can understand how sustainable is it. Yeah, that would be my view. Thank you.
Right. Thor, on the same question.
Like I did say, to be able to understand the entire reduction, you have to look at the entire program, tariff program in holistic. This is a work in progress, and we know. So today, IPPs are meeting with government, and they are sitting. And my feeling is that there's going to be smoke, white smoke at the end of the tunnel. Because like I did mention in our tete-a-tete, Julian, if you could remember, that in any arrangement, even in the best interest, for instance, in marriage, there can never be challenges here and there. And there is nothing that does not, or rather puts a barrier that parties cannot meet.
Yeah.
And we know these parties also has an interest in doing business in this ecosystem. So if I was an IPP, for instance, myself, I will go put on the table my expression of interest in terms of this is what I think, and you begin negotiation. And then again, remember one component, Amboko, like I did, like I would say it. There's also an issue of compliance. If you wait, for instance, government to come in last, because this window that we understand, IPPs have been given that latitude to be able to offer their expression of interest. In terms of what do you think that you can reduce, what do you think is your trade-off in this kind of an arrangement? If you wait then until when government come into the picture, those conversations about compliance will come in. And compliance here, it is it's not only in a domestic arrangement, but equally in those ratifications and instruments that this country has entered into with the international organization.
I see. I'm told by my director we have about 5 minutes to go, so let me get into the round of closing thoughts. And let me start with Kilna. Just your closing thoughts as we get into the take now.
Yeah, I think, you know, we should applaud what the President and the task force is doing here to shake up the sector. The sector needed shaking up. We do need to bring down the cost of power. What is very important is let us look at the integrated system, generation, transmission, distribution, and look at where can we get the biggest gains whilst ensuring sustainability of the system and ensuring we continue to get foreign direct investment that we need to continue building up the system. Whilst we are addressing all these critical issues, let us not lose sight of the fact that we have a growing demand. We must ensure that we meet that growing demand, because any loss of power or running out of power could have an enormous negative impact on our economy. So we must do everything in parallel, address these critical issues, but also bring on new power generation. And I think we must continue to look at the future. Kenya has an excellent future. Our power is generated 80 to 90% from renewable electricity. What this means is our transportation sector can become green. In 10 years' time, you won't find a fuel station in Europe, or you'll be hard-pressed to find one. That is going to come to Kenya, and our fuel will be truly green, which in the longer term will bring down the cost of transportation to the economy, which is fantastic. And finally, don't forget there's the green hydrogen economy coming, where we could start to use hydrogen generated by renewable energy to actually produce our own fertilizers, which we are currently importing. So there are multiple aspects here where I think Kenya has an excellent future, and it's important that we look at the sustainability of the system as a whole.
All right. For your closing thoughts in under a minute.
I want to echo similar sentiments like those ones of Kilna, and say that I really love the government in this concerted effort and the way they have taken lead in doing this. However, and maybe this we could have it in a subsequent discussion, there's a whole issue about demand that is not being talked about, and maybe at a point in time in the future we could be able to explore those areas and what is it that you need to do, what kind of interventions that needs to be put in place, both non-tariff and tariff interventions. But most critically also is that I pray, it is my prayer, that parties are of sound mind and come into play and understand the bottom line and how this inception about reducing power came into the picture, and how it ran through the mind of the head of state, so that we can go in a same direction. This country is ours, whether we are foreigners because we have interest in here, whether we are Kenyans because we live here and also do business here.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Right, unfortunately, that's all the time we had this evening. You can be sure this is not the last time we are having a conversation around power tariffs. I haven't even sampled your thoughts, I'm really sorry, but we shall continue to elicit this conversation on power tariffs and see how to take this conversation forward in our subsequent episodes.